Night had fallen over the frozen skies of northern Germany. It was December 20th, 1943. At 25,000 feet, the world was nothing but black smoke, red tracer fire, and the low hum of dying engines. Inside a shattered B-17 bomber, called Olde Pub, blood dripped from the cockpit ceiling, the oxygen system was shredded, and one of the 4 engines hung in flames. The pilot, 21-year-old Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown, could barely keep his eyes open. His crew was half dead, their guns silent, ammunition spent. The bomber's nose was torn open by flak. They were supposed to be heading home to England. Instead, they were adrift in enemy airspace, alone, crippled, and falling. Outside, a lone German fighter plane appeared like a ghost, rising from the clouds. A Messerschmitt Bf 109, sleek, deadly, and intact. Its pilot, Franz Stigler, had already shot down more than 20 Allied aircraft. One more, and he'd earn the coveted Knight's Cross, a medal every Luftwaffe ace dreamed of. And now, in front of him, was a gift from fate. A defenseless bomber, limping through the sky, its crew helpless. The rules of war were clear. Finish the kill. No mercy. Stigler lined up his sights. The bomber was so close he could see the faces inside, bloodied, terrified, clinging to life. He rested his finger on the trigger, and then something strange happened. He hesitated. In that frozen second above the North Sea, as flak exploded miles below, the German ace made a decision that defied every order, every instinct, and every expectation of war. He did not fire. Instead, he pulled alongside the dying bomber, so close that Charlie Brown could see the blue of Stigler's eyes through the canopy. The 2 men, enemies sworn to destroy each other, now flew wingtip to wingtip through German airspace. The Bf 109, once a hunter, became an escort. For more than 10 minutes, Stigler guided the crippled bomber out of German territory, protecting it from anti-aircraft batteries. And when the English Channel finally shimmered below, he raised his hand in a silent salute and turned back toward home. Charlie Brown and his crew made it back to England that night. No one could believe it. The bomber that should have exploded over Bremen had returned, torn apart, but alive. For decades, the full story remained a secret, buried beneath classified reports and the silence of men who had seen too much war. Only years later would the world learn that, in the middle of the deadliest air campaign of World War II, mercy had found its place among the clouds. But how could it be that, in a war built on hatred and destruction, a German fighter ace risked execution to save his enemy? What kind of man refuses to kill when the world demands it? And why did both pilots, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler, say that moment changed their lives forever? This is not a story about a battle. It's a story about a choice. The choice between duty and humanity, between vengeance and compassion, between killing and something far more powerful. This is the story of Ye Olde Pub. By late 1943, the skies over Europe had turned into a vast, burning battlefield. Every day, hundreds of bombers from England crossed the cold, gray waters of the North Sea, heading deep into the heart of the Third Reich. They carried one purpose: to break the backbone of Hitler's war machine. The American 8th Air Force called it precision daylight bombing, a strategy built on the promise that technology, discipline, and courage could change the course of the war. But daylight meant visibility. Visibility meant death. The B-17 Flying Fortress was the pride of American industry, a 4-engine behemoth armed with 13 machine guns, wrapped in armor, capable of taking a beating and still returning home. Crews called it a flying tank, the Germans had a different name: the porcupine, a beast too bristled with guns to approach head-on. Yet the Luftwaffe had adapted. They learned how to hunt fortresses in packs, attacking from above, diving out of the sun, tearing holes into formations that once seemed invincible. By winter, losses were staggering. On missions over Schweinfurt and Regensburg, entire squadrons vanished. Young crews, barely out of training, were sent into the air knowing that 1 in 5 might never come back. At the debriefings, empty chairs spoke louder than words. Germany, despite the bombing, still held the skies. The Luftwaffe's Jagdgeschwader, fighter wings flying Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, were led by men forged in the crucible of years of combat. They were veterans of the Battle of Britain, of North Africa, of the Eastern Front. Pilots like Franz Stigler had learned not just to fly, but to survive. For them, every fight was a duel of reflexes and instinct. The Germans fought with fewer planes but sharper skills. The Americans fought with more planes but less experience. In this deadly equation, compassion had no place. On the ground, war planners viewed the air campaign as mathematics. Targets, payloads, fuel range, loss ratio. To the men in the cockpit, it was something else entirely. A slow drift between life and death, measured in seconds and altitude. Every mission began with coffee and laughter in the briefing room. But by the time they reached enemy territory, the laughter was gone. Then came the flak, black puffs of steel bursting in the air like invisible fists. Each explosion could shred a wing, sever a control line, or kill a gunner outright. When the fighters arrived, the sky turned into chaos. Contrails twisting like scars, planes spinning in flames, radio calls drowned in static. Charlie Brown had flown only a few missions before the day that would make his name immortal. He was young, idealistic, and determined to do his duty. The target that morning was Bremen, a vital industrial center producing Focke-Wulf aircraft. It was a fortress of smokestacks and anti-aircraft guns. Everyone knew the risks. But orders were orders. The formation lifted off from Kimbolton, England, engines roaring in unison, the silver wings glinting in the weak winter sun. Meanwhile, across the continent, German pilots scrambled from their bases as the air raid sirens wailed. To them, the bombers were invaders, bringing death to their cities and families. Each side believed they were defending civilization itself. There was no room for mercy, only duty, survival, and the unspoken understanding that if you hesitated for a second, you died. Yet not all Luftwaffe pilots were blind followers. Many, like Franz Stigler, had been raised in an earlier age of aviation, a time when chivalry still meant something. Stigler's first instructor, Gustav Rodel, had told him, "You fight to protect, not to kill. If I ever hear that you shot a man in his parachute, I'll shoot you myself." These words had stayed with him through North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, through years of watching comrades fall and enemies burn. By late 1943, however, that code was dying. The war had become mechanical, ruthless, industrial. Pilots were no longer knights, they were cogs in a massive killing machine. And still, a few held on to something fragile, the belief that honor could survive even here, in the fire and smoke. As the Allied raids intensified, the German defenses grew desperate. Fighter groups were stretched thin, their fuel running low, their veterans exhausted. Younger pilots replaced the fallen, boys with barely 50 hours of flight time. And in the middle of this crumbling front stood men like Stigler, battle-hardened, weary, questioning the purpose of it all. So when, on that cold December morning, Stigler took off from his base in northern Germany, he did what he had done countless times before: climb, find the bombers, strike, survive. But what he would encounter that day would not be another target. It would be a choice, a moral test born from a sky filled with hatred and exhaustion. The background of Olde Pub's mission was not unique, just one bomber among hundreds. Yet the air war had reached such brutality that even a single act of compassion would echo louder than 1,000 explosions. And it was in this world of burned-out cities and steel rain, amid orders to kill and instincts to live, that the story truly began. The story of the bomber that did not explode, and the German pilot who refused to let it die. By the winter of 1943, the air war over Europe had become a grinder of men and metal. Every dawn began the same way: crews assembling in freezing hangars, gulping black coffee, pretending not to see the empty bunks in the barracks. The veterans had stopped asking who was flying which plane. The newcomers were already ghosts. They just hadn't crashed yet. At the morning briefings, maps filled with red lines stretched deep into Germany: Bremen, Kiel, Hamburg, Berlin. Commanders pointed at the routes with their sticks, voices steady, confident. But everyone in the room knew the truth. The deeper they went, the fewer came back. "Remember," one colonel said before takeoff, "we're here to break their will." But whose will was breaking faster, the enemy's or theirs? For the crews of the flying fortresses, the sky was no longer a battlefield. It was a meat grinder spinning without pause. The German flak batteries grew smarter, their shells detonating with surgical precision. Fighters came from every angle, appearing out of the sun like vultures. Some bombers disappeared in a single flash. A fuel tank hit, a chain of explosions, then silence. Others limped home, half their crew dead, their fuselage torn open like paper. Charlie Brown had seen it all. He had flown missions where the formation vanished one plane at a time, the empty spots in the sky as haunting as the empty chairs in the mess hall. Each loss carved a little deeper into the morale of the survivors. They joked less. They prayed more. Reports from returning crews were becoming unbearable. Bomb runs that were supposed to cripple the enemy often missed their targets entirely. Smoke, cloud cover, and constant evasive maneuvers made accuracy nearly impossible. And yet, command demanded results. More sorties, deeper strikes, fewer excuses. To the generals, it was statistics. To the men, it was suicide by numbers. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe was evolving. Their tactics had grown cold and merciless. Experienced aces like Franz Stigler now led Sturmgruppen, specialized assault units, trained to tear through bomber formations at close range. They loaded their fighters with heavy cannons, 20 millimeters, 30 millimeters, even 37 millimeter guns, designed to rip through a B-17's armor in seconds. Some pilots went so far as to strap extra armor onto their cockpits, accepting slower speeds for the chance to survive a few seconds longer in the killing zone. The Americans responded with tighter formations, the combat box. In theory, it created a wall of overlapping gunfire. In practice, it turned the bombers into a single, massive target. Once the lead ship fell, chaos followed. Broken formations meant certain death. Many gunners fired until their barrels glowed red, desperate and blind, hitting nothing but empty sky. Morale plummeted. The cheerful recruiting posters, "Come fly with the mighty Eighth," now felt like cruel jokes. By November, Loss rates on certain missions reached 30%. No soldier on Earth could survive that kind of math for long. On the German side, the situation was no less grim. Their pilots were burning out. Fuel was scarce, replacements inexperienced. Every new American raid meant another scramble, another wave of fire and smoke. Some Luftwaffe aces had survived hundreds of missions and knew that sooner or later their luck would end. For men like Franz Stigler, the glory of the early war years had evaporated. Now there was only duty, exhaustion, and the gnawing feeling that none of it meant anything anymore. One bitter morning, after a sortie that left half his squadron missing, Stigler walked the flight line in silence. The hangars smelled of oil and burned rubber. Mechanics worked in the cold, repairing planes that would probably never fly again. He looked up at the gray sky and felt nothing, just numbness. The medals pinned to his jacket felt like weights. He had earned them through skill and luck, and yet each one was a reminder of the faces that never came back. Somewhere above him, bombers were already forming again, like a moving city of silver wings. The war had become endless, a self-consuming cycle. The Americans bombed by day, the British by night, and between them, Germany was being erased from the map. Both sides were trapped in the same paradox. The more they fought, the less human they became. Killing had turned into routine. Survival into mathematics. The only thing rarer than victory was meaning. And yet inside that numbness, something still flickered. A small, stubborn belief that there had to be another way to live, or at least another way to fight. No one could have known it then, but this slow collapse, this exhaustion, this despair, was the soil from which one of the most extraordinary moments of mercy in the entire war would grow. Because sometimes when men are pushed to the edge of everything they understand, that is where true courage begins. December 20th, 1943. It began like any other bombing mission, cold, gray, mechanical. Charlie Brown's crew of 10 climbed into Olde Pub, their B-17, with the same routine they had rehearsed countless times. The engines thundered to life. They joked, as always, to hide the fear. Someone taped a pin-up girl on the instrument panel. Someone else crossed himself quietly before takeoff. Their target was Bremen, an industrial city guarded by some of the heaviest flak in Germany. The mission brief said it would be moderately dangerous. That was code for hell on Earth. Hours later, the formation crossed the coastline, and the black bursts of flak began immediately. Shells exploded in perfect timing, cutting through the thin winter air. The first hit came near the right wing. Shrapnel tore through the fuselage like glass. Then another closer. The bomber shuddered. One engine caught fire, then died. Brown gripped the controls, his gloves slick with sweat. "Feather number 2, he shouted. The crew obeyed, fighting to keep the plane level. But more shells followed. The plexiglass nose shattered, spraying shards across the navigator's station. The oxygen system was gone. Gunners screamed through the intercom, tail hit, waist gun jammed, ammo running low. The cold was so deep, it bit through their flight suits like knives. Still, Brown refused to turn back. He was 21, idealistic, carrying not just bombs, but responsibility for his crew, for his mission, for the thousands of others flying beside him. They pressed on. When the bomb bay doors opened, they dropped their payload on target. But the damage was too severe. As the formation turned toward England, Olde Pub couldn't keep up. The crippled bomber drifted behind, slower, lower, bleeding altitude and smoke. Then came the fighters. A swarm of Messerschmitt Bf-109s descended from above, diving through the sun. The first burst ripped into the tail section, killing the tail gunner instantly. Another hit took out the ball turret gunner. Brown tried evasive maneuvers, but the plane responded sluggishly. One by one, the remaining gunners went silent, wounded or dead. When the German fighters finally broke off, the B-17 was a floating wreck. Half the crew was unconscious. Blood pooled on the floor. Holes as wide as fists punctured the wings. The controls were barely holding. Charlie Brown could feel his vision fading. Oxygen deprivation. Shock. Exhaustion. Yet he clung to one thought: get the crew home. Somewhere below, another plane took off from a Luftwaffe base near Bremen, a Bf-109 flown by veteran ace Franz Stigler. He had already fought that morning, downing 2 bombers. His ammunition was nearly spent, but when he saw a lone fortress limping across the sky, instinct took over. He climbed higher, closing the distance. The bomber was unlike anything he'd seen, riddled with holes, its tail half gone, one engine burning, the other feathered. It was a miracle the thing was still flying. Through the canopy, he could see faces inside, young, pale, bloodied. The nose gunner slumped over, the side turret unmanned, the tail missing entirely. He realized the plane wasn't fighting, it was dying. Stigler lined up his sights anyway. That was the job. One more burst, and he'd earn the Knight's Cross. He tightened his grip on the trigger. Then, something stopped him. Inside the shattered bomber, through the clear winter air, he saw the pilot, Charlie Brown, staring back. The American's face was gray from blood loss, his hands trembling on the controls. Behind him, one of the crew was trying to bandage another man's wounds with a piece of his own parachute. It didn't look like an enemy. It looked like a massacre. Stigler hesitated. Memories flooded back. His first instructor's words. "You fight to protect, not to kill. If I ever hear that you shot a man in his parachute, I'll shoot you myself." He eased off the trigger. Instead of attacking, he pulled alongside the bomber. The 2 planes, Hunter and Prey, now flew side by side through the frozen sky. Brown, half conscious, saw the German and thought it was the end. But the Bf-109 didn't fire. It simply hovered there, matching speed, wingtips only a few yards apart. Through the cracked glass, Stigler gestured, pointing down, trying to tell Brown to land in Germany. But Brown shook his head weakly. Home was west. England. For several long minutes they flew together, locked in an impossible dance, 2 enemies sharing the same strip of sky. German flak towers below held their fire, confused by the sight of their own fighter escorting an American bomber. Stigler knew what he was doing was treason. If anyone saw, he could be court-martialed, even executed. Yet he stayed with them, across the German coast, out over the North Sea, until the shimmering horizon of safety appeared. Then slowly, he pulled away. Before he turned back, he raised his hand in a final salute. Brown saw it through the shattered glass, and nodded weakly in return. Then the German vanished into the clouds. For the next several hours, WWII Olde Pub limped across the water, held together by faith and aluminum. When it finally touched down in England, the crew staggered out in disbelief. The bomber was so damaged that ground crews counted over 400 bullet holes. One engineer said flatly, "It shouldn't have flown another mile." When intelligence officers asked Brown what happened out there, He told them everything. A German fighter had them dead to rights and spared them. The officers ordered him to keep it secret. If word got out, they said, other pilots might start hesitating too. Mercy in war was dangerous, but the story wouldn't die. Because somewhere in Germany, another pilot, Franz Stigler, went home that day in silence, knowing he had saved his enemy and wondering if anyone would ever understand why. When WWII Olde Pub finally touched down at its base in England, the airfield crew stood in stunned silence. The bomber was more whole than metal. Entire sections of fuselage were shredded, the tail barely attached, and one propeller hung lifeless like a broken limb. The men who crawled out were pale, bloodied, but alive. Against every law of physics, the plane had made it home. Charlie Brown was taken to the infirmary, drifting in and out of consciousness. When he woke, officers were already waiting with notebooks and questions. What happened? Who was the German pilot? How had they survived? Brown told them the truth. A German fighter had them in his sights and let them go. The intelligence officers exchanged uneasy glances. Then came the order. Never speak of this again. It was wartime. Stories of mercy didn't fit into reports of victory. They didn't motivate men to fight harder. Compassion was not an approved weapon. So the file was buried. The men returned to duty. And the sky kept burning. For the rest of the war, Charlie Brown flew more missions. He watched other bombers vanish, other crews fail to return. But in quiet moments, he always thought of that German pilot, the man who had spared them when no one else would have. Sometimes before takeoff, he caught himself scanning the horizon, as if expecting to see that same Messerschmitt flying beside him again. Across the ruins of Europe, Franz Stigler also kept silent. He finished the war without ever claiming the kill that would have earned him the Knight's Cross. By 1945, his country was in ruins, his airfields burned, his friends either dead or captured. When the war ended, he was just another defeated soldier, haunted by the faces of the young men he had fought against, and those he hadn't. He emigrated to Canada after the war, trying to start over. The world didn't want to hear from former Luftwaffe pilots. He worked quietly, built a new life, and spoke little of the past. But sometimes at night, he would take out his logbook and stare at one blank line, December 20th, 1943. He could have written B-17 destroyed. Instead, he had left it empty. Decades passed. The world changed. But neither man forgot. In 1986, more than 40 years later, Charlie Brown, now a retired Air Force colonel, was still haunted by that winter day over Bremen. He decided to search for the German pilot who had saved him. Using veterans' networks and historical societies, he sent letters across Europe describing the encounter. Most replies were dead ends. Then one day, a letter arrived from Canada. It was from Franz Stigler. He wrote simply, "I was the one." When they finally met, both men were old, gray-haired, soft-spoken, their faces lined by time. Yet when they saw each other, there was no awkwardness, no tension. They embraced like brothers who had been separated for a lifetime. "I never expected to live to see you again," Brown said. Stigler replied, "I never expected you to survive that flight." For the rest of their lives, they remained inseparable. They visited air shows together, shared meals, even spent Christmases side by side. Journalists who met them often said they behaved like family, because in many ways they were. The story spread slowly, then widely. Newspapers, documentaries, historians, all wanted to understand what had happened that day in 1943. In a war defined by cruelty and obedience, How could a German fighter pilot risk execution to spare an enemy? Stigler's answer was always the same. I couldn't have shot them. I would have felt like I was shooting at a man in a parachute. When asked if he regretted it, he smiled. No, Charlie was my enemy then. But after that day, he became my friend. The consequences of that act were far greater than either man could have imagined. Their story became a testament that even amid the machinery of total war, humanity could still flicker and survive. It challenged the idea that mercy was weakness. It showed that morality could exist not in peace, but precisely in the heart of conflict. In time, their friendship became a symbol of reconciliation. Veterans who had once refused to speak to Germans began to rethink their memories. Schools told the story to teach that courage is not only in fighting, but also in choosing not to. When Franz Stigler died in 2008, Charlie Brown said, "My brother has gone home." They had spent their final years living just a few miles apart, bound by a secret moment of grace in the middle of a storm that had consumed millions. The war had tried to erase everything human. But one act, one refusal to pull the trigger, had endured. And long after the guns fell silent, the world remembered that in the worst of times, mercy could still fly. History often remembers the loudest things, the explosions, the victories, the speeches, the flags waving over ruins. But sometimes the most important moments happen in silence. No gunfire, no orders. Just a man, his hand on a trigger, and the decision not to pull it. The story of Olde Pub and Franz Stigler is one of those rare moments when humanity triumphed quietly, against every expectation of war. It began as a routine mission over Bremen and ended as something much greater. A reminder that even when the world is at its most violent, the human heart can still choose compassion. In military history, pilots are often celebrated for their kills, their precision, their courage under fire. But Stigler's act redefined what courage could mean. It wasn't just the bravery to fight. It was the bravery to disobey, to see an enemy as a person rather than a target. In the brutal logic of total war, mercy was rebellion. And in that rebellion lay true honor. For Charlie Brown, the encounter transformed his understanding of war. He had been trained to believe in victory through destruction, in survival through superiority. Yet the man who saved him that day had done so not by shooting, but by refusing to. After the war, Brown often said that moment taught him more about the value of life than all his years in combat ever could. When the two men spoke publicly together in their later years, they never called their story a miracle. They called it a choice. Everyone, Brown once said, has a line they will not cross. Franz found his line that day, and by honoring it, he gave me my life. Stigler, for his part, saw it differently. It wasn't about the enemy, he said. It was about what kind of man I wanted to be when the war was over. And perhaps that is why their story resonates even now, because it asks a question that transcends uniforms, borders, and centuries. Who are we when no one is watching? Decades after the war, when historians interviewed surviving pilots from both sides, they spoke of exhaustion, fear, and hatred, but very few spoke of empathy. The air war over Europe was a machine that devoured everything human. Yet somehow, in that cold sky, two men broke free of it, even if only for a few minutes. In modern military academies, their story is sometimes retold, not as a lesson in tactics, but as a lesson in ethics. It reminds soldiers and civilians alike that honor is not measured by obedience, but by conscience. that real strength lies not in domination, but in restraint. Today, replicas of Olde Pub and Stigler's Messerschmitt are displayed in museums. Children press their faces to the glass, staring at the bullet holes, the faded paint, the photographs of two men who should have killed each other but didn't. They read the inscription beneath their picture. Enemies became brothers. It's easy to see history as a series of battles, dates, and numbers. Harder is to see it as a collection of choices, each made by ordinary people, each carrying the weight of what it means to be human. War will always test those choices. It strips away everything until all that's left is the question of who we are at our core. And on December 20th, 1943, somewhere above the frozen clouds of Germany, two men answered that question, not with hatred, not with bullets, but with mercy. Because sometimes the greatest victory in war is simply refusing to become what the war wants you to be. And so the bomber that did not explode became a legend, not for the bombs it dropped, but for the man who refused to let it fall.